Well, good afternoon, everyone. And in this second talk, I'd like to build on the first talk. It's called The Tyranny of Vaccinology. And we're going to look at topics really related to the ethos and the practice around vaccination, including mandatory vaccinations around the world, and how this is a topic that can affect Christians from a Christian perspective. As always, once available, I'll put the talk with all the references on my website, alltherisks.com, where you can also find some other resources. So by way of overview, we'll look at 4 sections in this talk. Firstly, we'll look at vaccinology around the globe today. So this idea of vaccinating mass and at scale, vaccinating the children, having mandates, how that looks in different countries, and we'll also see how that affects the UK, and we'll look at some legal aspects as well. Secondly, we'll do a quick review and we'll do a case study back in the dark days of the COVID tyranny to see what lessons we can learn from that. Thirdly, we'll do a pretty broad sweep over the last couple of decades, and we'll look at those brave individuals who have dissented from the narrative. Those doctors, scientists, researchers, we'll see what kind of repercussions they faced, even parents who've been affected by this issue. And finally, we'll review vaccines and declining mortality, and we'll try to ask the questions, are vaccines really responsible for declining mortality rates and increasing life expectancy over the last sort of 120 years or so, since about 1900? And once again, as before, important context, this talk aims to provide a biblical framework to understand the topic of vaccines. So we may give some references to scripture. We will think about things from a Christian perspective unashamedly. As always, the word of God is unchangeable and alone is the final authority in all matters of our faith. So if you have any challenges from the word of God to bring to me, I'll be more than happy to hear it. Thirdly, this talk does not constitute medical advice. It's there to inform and to educate, to help you reach the right decisions for this topic for you and your family. And I just want to say as well, this talk will cover some things that could be difficult to hear if it's affected you or if it's something that's very close to your heart. So I'm not unaware of how impactful some of the topics I will speak about. You know, when we're talking about children and babies and health and sickness, this is a really intense topic. So I am very conscious of that. It is with a very heavy heart that I speak of some of these things as well. And I didn't take it on lightly as well. I did try to read as much as I can into the subject. So our first section is Vaccinology Globally. So we have a map here produced from Our World in Data, and the reference they've actually built from is provided at the bottom. What you're seeing is countries labeled according to whether they have mandatory childhood vaccination policies. So in blue, what you can see are countries where it's only recommended in dark blue. So you'll be pleased to know that the UK and Ireland and Northern Ireland is all in the recommended section. So you don't have to take these vaccines for children, either to enter school or even just aside from school. In terms of registration with the health facilities, there's no there shouldn't be any punitive fines or anything like that. I say there shouldn't be. There is sometimes still instances of coercion and things like that. But that's actually quite good news. You can see other parts like Canada and Australia in the same boat, really. So they're recommended. Okay, that's where we're at today. Now, moving on, you can see some parts in kind of yellow where it's mandatory for school entry. We can pick up on United States, for example. Now, US, obviously, you have the 50 states. So it's going to come down to your particular state. We're going to see 6 states a little bit later where it's particularly tough, and we'll be coming to that, California being one of them. But basically, yeah, by and large, it can be mandatory for school entry. Then you have exemptions and stuff, but we'll talk about states where you can't even get exemptions. So, you know, USA is in a different category. But then there's also those countries in orange. We'll be talking about Brazil in a moment, where it's just mandatory. In other words, if you don't vaccinate, they're going to start coming after you. So look at how much of the world in South America, North Africa, parts of Europe and Asia, it's actually mandatory for children to have vaccines. So I say that to say, this is a pretty serious topic globally, and we're going to consider some of those ways in a moment. Starting with Brazil. So I have a quote here of just how tough the situation is in Brazil. And imagine if this was a situation we were facing. That's a long quote, the longest quote I have today, but I'll try to read through it for you. So this is from last year, from 2024, from the British Journal of Healthcare and Medical Research. So it says that Brazilian parents of children are obliged from January 2024 to vaccinate their children from 6 months to 5 years with 3 doses of Pfizer's vaccine. Anyone who opposes risks losing parental authority. All of this happens without the issuance of a law, but through a technical note from the Brazilian Ministry of Health. So they tried to circumvent the legal process and do it through a quick note. And it has included, so they've added it in there, the anti-COVID vaccine as mandatory for children. In this age group, 142 children have died in 3 years of the pandemic, while the total number of Brazilian children is over 18 million. So that's 0.00025% of the population. They don't know of a single child who even died of COVID in Germany, for example. But according to the president, President Lula, we must criminalize those who do not vaccinate their children. Fines of thousands of euros, loss of state subsidies, and even parental authority are foreseen. So it's not that this is a small topic, just because perhaps it's in the recommended section for us right now for some vaccines. In other places, it's mandatory. Coming a bit closer to home, what about child medical consent in the UK? So on the right side, you can see a green cover. This is an online resource that's available freely. It's produced by UK Health Security Agency, formerly Public Health England, and we're going to be quoting from Chapter 2 on consent. So it basically outlines as an online resource all about vaccination. So like who should be vaccinated, when they should be vaccinated, and Chapter 2 is consent. Now, in this quote, it says from Chapter 2, where someone aged 16 or 17 years consents to vaccination, a parent cannot override that consent. So that's where we are in the UK in terms of children. But as far as younger children, so younger people, so below the age of 16, who understand fully what is involved in the proposed procedure, that's the vaccination, referred to as Gillick competence, can also give consent, although ideally their parents will be involved. If a Gillick competent child consents to treatment, a parent cannot override that consent. And you say, well, what about if they're 13, 14, 12? Yes, if they consider them in the eyes of the vaccinator or whoever has that medical authority in the school at that time, believes that that child is able to make an informed decision, they can unilaterally decide to take it. So that's pretty serious. And I mentioned that to call it out, that if this isn't a topic that affects you, then you have to be very careful. If your children go to a school where they bring the vaccinators in, if they are of a certain age, like, you know, let's say secondary school, right? And if they're quite intelligent and seem like they really, you know, have their brain switched on and they're very able to elucidate things and explain things and understand concepts and get what the vaccinator is saying, then theoretically they could actually unilaterally decide to take the vaccine. And potentially, even if it's not complying with your own requests, for example. It's not going to happen every day, but it certainly could happen. And it's something that you should be very cautious of. But also, if you think about how it often works in a school, when the children are called for their vaccination, like in a room like this, where everyone's sat down, and they say, right, everyone, we're off to the school hall to get our vaccines. And if you don't want it, please stand up or go to the side of the room. You're going to be collected by the teaching assistant. You're going to go down to the school hall, the gymnasium or something. I mean, that's coercion for a lot of children. You know, most children at school, I've been a teacher for a couple of years when I first graduated, I'm not anymore. But, you know, most children just want to fit in. They don't want to raise their head above the parapet. They don't want to be different. They don't want to stick out, etc. And this is a time where often a child could be seen to be different, that they've got parents with different values, they have different ideas about health and so forth. So it's really not appropriate. And I would question whether the whole system is even fair in the first place. But the point I'm trying to make is, if the child goes into a school and they're of a certain age, say in high school, for example, on the day that they're being vaccinated, there is always the risk that the vaccinator could deem them to be Gillick competent, and they could be, because in that time, the school will be, I suppose, assumed to have the teachers loco parentis. So, you know, in place of the parents, have that parental authority, and that's how they can come to these kinds of decisions, basically. So it's really important that you understand that on the day of the vaccination, there's always that risk because of Gillick competence in the UK. Now, changing topics slightly, thinking about missionary work, you know, in terms of how big this topic is. We've seen mandatory vaccines, we've seen the situation for the school children in the UK. But, you know, how many missions make it dependent that you have vaccines in order to do missionary work? What a big topic this really is. I mean, here we have, back in September 2021, published by Christianity Today, a report about the Southern Baptist Convention. So it says here that the global agency of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest evangelical Protestant denomination in the US, announced, this is September 21, that it's requiring vaccinations, that's the COVID vaccine, for missionaries they're sending into the field amid the pandemic. So, largest evangelical Protestant denomination required the COVID-19 vaccine to do missionary work. So I hope that just underscores, even within the church, this is a huge and major topic. There's no doubt about it. This affects the whole world. It affects missions. It affects the church. No doubt about it. And even before we had the COVID vaccine, of course, we still had the vaccine passports and those schemes that came in for about 3 weeks in Northern Ireland before it was thankfully repealed. We still have a long-standing physical certificate-based system really for yellow fever. It's basically what it's mostly used for, which is the International Certificate of Vaccination or Prophylaxis in the top right. You can see the insignia or the emblem of the World Health Organization. So this, also known in French as carte jaune or the yellow card, is an official vaccination report created by the WHO. So WHO state parties in Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Central America, and Trinidad and the Caribbean require presentation of this yellow card booklet for yellow fever vaccination as a condition of entry-exit. So again, if you want to do, say, the Lord's work, or you want to do missionary work in these kinds of countries, then having a yellow fever vaccine is going to be a requirement in order to do so. And this particular vaccine, although it's not created in a human cell line, the vaccine called Stamaril, available in the UK, is another live attenuated viral vaccine. So you are being exposed to a form of yellow fever that's live, that's replicating, potentially could spread to someone else perhaps, and it's produced in chick embryos or chicken eggs. So again, it's not something you want. When it comes to entering and exiting these countries, there's not really much choice about it. And also just want to think about measles and mandates as well, because measles is a sort of highly contagious viral infection. And we can have a think about the outbreaks that happen sometimes. There's actually, I think it's in Texas right now, there's a bit of an outbreak. You're probably hearing a few things about measles. You will from time to time, because measles always kind of comes and goes and has little fits and it starts popping up again. But back in 2014, 2015, and you can see at the bottom right, at Disneyland Resort, California, there was a famous measles outbreak. But what was so interesting was it actually led to a strengthening of the law. And what happened is, just a short time after it, in California, the state where it occurred, they actually prohibited or banned parents from opting out based on personal beliefs of the vaccine. So it became kind of mandatory with no exemptions. This was California Senate Bill SB 277, and it appealed the California personal belief exemption for vaccines. So imagine that. If you have a problem with the measles or the MMR vaccine, whether that's ethical, whether that's from health reasons, in California, which is one of 6 US states, it doesn't allow religious exemptions. So again, that's the United States. That's not Brazil. That's not, a country in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's the United States. That's the situation in 6 states. So it obviously affects lots of Christians. But did you know this about measles? You're probably all familiar with the measles rash in the top right, with that very famous rash and appearance that, takes over large parts of the body sometimes. But did you know that a large study in Japan found that measles and mumps infections are associated with significantly less cardiovascular mortality in adult life? It may sound very surprising, but I mentioned in the first talk that viruses and bacteria can be commensal. They can get on very well in your body. For example, the microbiome in the gut, for example. You have all kinds of bacteria that you need and you want to promote, for example. But even the same thing can be true of viruses. So for example, not just measles, but if you have natural chickenpox infection, if you've been to a chickenpox party maybe, not very popular these days maybe with the media, but if you went to it, you're protected later in life against developing shingles, which is actually really painful. I'd rather have a dose of chickenpox as a child and then not have to deal with shingles later. In the same way, measles and mumps have been shown to have significantly less cardiovascular mortality associated with them. So again, it shouldn't be that surprising once you understand that viruses are not always going to be killing you. Said in the first talk, every mouthful, 5,000 viruses, 10,000 bacteria, 1 or 2 fungi. So it's not the case they're always trying to hurt you. And in any case, in this study as well we've got from Rosen, they found that measles can be spread by double-dose vaccinated MMR recipients to other fully vaccinated double-dose recipients. So it's not the case that if you have the MMR, you're never going to contract or transmit measles. That's not true. And in another large outbreak in Quebec, Canada in 2011, the index patient, that's the sort of patient zero that they said, well, this is where the outbreak came from, was measles vaccinated in childhood. So that's not too good. And 49% of all measles case in a school in this particular outbreak were also fully measles vaccinated children. So it's not the case that if you take the vaccine, you can't transmit it or even start an epidemic. That's also possible. Second section I'd like to look at then is coming back to the dark days of the COVID tyranny. And to start with, I'd like to remind you, in his younger days there, I think that picture's a little bit older, of the Dr. Anthony Fauci. And here he is saying in Washington, D.C., after his role has come to an end at NIAID, I don't recall like a discussion of now it's going to be. It sort of just happened. It sort of just appeared. That 6 feet is going to be the distance. So he's admitting that it's completely arbitrary. There's no science behind it. You can see the posters there. Keep a safe distance. Thank you for practicing social distancing. Maintain social distancing. You had stickers on the floor and on the ground of the shopping malls, of the supermarkets. But it's completely arbitrary. Like so many things within the COVID response, there was no real science behind it. It was arbitrary. And a few more lies to remind you of, I'm sure. You can recall some of these. Face masks, for example. You can see some images in the middle of the pollution that it's causing within the seas. That's not very nice. But obviously, you can't stop an airborne virus with these cloth or paper face masks. PCR tests, well, of course, we know they were run at high cycle thresholds. The inventor, Kerry Mullins, had also cautioned against their use in this kind of scenario. Test and trace, we'll see in the next slide, in the UK from the NHS was a huge waste of money. And you can see some headlines actually at the top right. What a £13 billion waste. So you can see all about the COVID loan fraud and the PPE failings as well. PPE as well, again, just became another industry to make money. Social distancing, which we've mentioned. Treatment protocols, we'll come and see in a moment how they were suppressed. And even known treatments that worked and were getting good results were not allowed to spread and to be known about. And of course, the hope, you can see at the bottom right, of this idea of the vaccine passport to unlock the economy. But of course, all that did is create division, create a lot of stress, and was used to divide people ultimately. So lots of things were claimed, but lots of things were lies. And as I mentioned, when it comes to the test and trace, what an eye-watering budget it really was. In 2020 to 21, the NHS test and trace budget breakdown of £13.5 billion total spend. I mean, how do you get £10.4 billion on testing? I mean, I cannot conceive of that. No amount of trying to make that work works. You know, it was supposed to be a relatively simple idea, you know, whether it was the lateral flow test that they gave people or these centers where you came in and got a PCR test or whatever. But, you know, it's not rocket science. If they're going to run a program, it can't cost £10.4 billion. It doesn't make any sense. £1.8 billion on containing activities, that's local response to outbreaks, 0.9 billion on tracing activities. So again, it's basically a call center where you call people up and you put things in a computer, but it costs almost £1 billion. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I consider this really to be a form of tyranny, really, because it's taking public finances, we all pay into the tax system, and these numbers are actually coming straight from the National Audit Office. So these are the accurate numbers. And as I mentioned, even the natural and repurposed treatments, well, they were completely suppressed. So there was previous research on other coronaviruses before SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19. And the research on these coronaviruses already suggested clinical benefit of using chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine and zinc ionophores to thwart the propagation or the growth of the coronaviruses. This was all known. You can see a couple of papers there I've got mentioned from 2005 and from 2010. So chloroquine is a potent inhibitor of SARS coronavirus infection and spread. So that's what 15 years before we start hearing about COVID. And then again, a good 10 years before, we have ionized zinc inhibits coronavirus and arteriovirus RNA polymerase activity, so in vitro in the lab. And also zinc ionophores block the replication of these viruses in cell culture. So they knew these ideas already. And all that happened was you had researchers who actually read papers, like Dr. Didier Raoult at the bottom, from France who used hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, the late Dr. Vladimir Zelenko in New York who used hydroxychloroquine, the antibiotic azithromycin, and also zinc to treat patients, and they got great results. But of course, they weren't celebrated. We didn't all hear about their results. Instead, you started to hear about, in sort of May 2020, ventilators, and hearing about, let people get like low blood oxygen and become hypoxic at home and don't treat them early, for example. None of this accords with good medical practice, and none of it accords with what was in the literature as well. Instead, we got all the lies that we saw in the last slide. And having briefly reviewed what happened with COVID, which you're probably mostly familiar with, probably heard quite a lot about it, I want to take a little bit longer now to review the dissenting voices who have been hounded for years to try to explain where they're coming from, the problems they face from trying to get their voice out there, and we can consider whether they might have something that we need to listen to, whether they might be worth heeding. The first one you may well have heard of, Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who was gastroenterology expert at the Royal Free Hospital in North London in Hampstead in the 1990s. Now, if you recall from the first talk, the MMR vaccine only came out in the UK in 1988. So by the time you get to the mid-90s with Dr. Wakefield, you're only kind of, less than 10 years actually into the rollout of MMR. Things can take a while in terms of safety signals before you start to pick them up. It's called pharmacovigilance, right? It can take years, it can take decades to actually work out things are causing a problem. A bit like with the thalidomide, for example, it's not necessarily apparent. It might be causing harm immediately, but you might not detect the safety signal straight away. What you really need is you need parents, you need doctors, you need scientists, you need researchers, you need members of the general public to flag things up through the reporting systems, through using their voice to let you know if there's a problem. So here we find Dr. Wakefield, gastroenterology expert in London, and he's just going about his business. And he starts getting parents coming to him saying, my child had the MMR and they weren't the same afterwards. My child had the MMR and they started to have autism or autism-like symptoms. So he wrote up a case series, which just means he wasn't saying there was a link. He wasn't saying that, the MMR vaccine causes autism. It's not there in the paper. He said, hey, I'm going to present a series of children to you in this report to consider the possibility that these two things might not be unrelated. He was also very interested in the measles virus in the gut as well. He wasn't only interested in the vaccine. He was trying to basically work out the link between gut health and neurological health, which over the last few years has become a lot better understood and respected. So there's a real logic to it. But his paper in 1998, published in The Lancet, the case series of the 12 children, was ultimately retracted because it had so much heat that was generated, so much criticism. But, when he published the paper, he also did a press conference straight away, and it had the dean of the Royal Free Hospital right there with him. So it wasn't that he was on his own. He had a number of co-authors. Now, some of them may have come away from the paper over time because of all the pressure, but this was a very well-respected piece of work when it initially came out. The problem was for him that it generated such a level of interest into the newspapers that they started to worry that the whole MMR vaccine program was going to collapse under the weight of these kinds of accounts. But all he did was tell the story, the case series of these children. 8 of the 12 children in the story, their parents were saying they believed this is due to the MMR vaccine. And he wanted to make sure that was in the paper and that was understood. So that potential story, that potential link could come out lest it be very important and lest it make a difference to children's health. And here's actually the quote I'd like to give from Dr. Wakefield himself. So in 1995, parents started contacting me saying, my child was perfectly fine. They were absolutely normal. I took them to be vaccinated with MMR on time. I wasn't anti-vaccine. I did what the doctor said. And my child immediately had a seizure or went to sleep for 3 days. When they woke up, they were gone. The lights had gone out in their eyes. They had disappeared. Their speech, language, interactions, socialization with their siblings had all gone. I'd lost my child and they were eventually diagnosed with autism. So I'd like you to put yourself in Dr. Wakefield's shoes in the 1990s. There's been a vaccine that's only been out for 5, 7, 10 years. You start having parents giving you this heartbreaking story. You're a scientist, you're curious, you're not afraid to ask the questions. Because remember, as we said in the first talk, in the conclusion, vaccines, it's just an empirical science. That's all it is. It's just observation. There's nothing. That's why they vaccinate the animals, because it's an empirical science. It's not logically deducible at all points. When you have something this complicated, all you can do is test, observe, look, observe, study, observe, and so on, and conjecture. There's nothing else you can do, because there's no reason why a vaccine should be safe. No reason why a vaccine should be effective a priori. It has to prove itself, just like anything else in empirical science. I also want to give a mother's experience of the MMR vaccine. On the right side, you can see this mother in America, Mary Wildman, and on the left, her son, Nicholas. This is from 2015. So this is her account of Nicholas's experience after the MMR. This was unbelievable screaming. We got about 10 minutes down the road from the appointment, from the injection. We had to pull over because he was screaming so violently. He wasn't talking anymore. He wasn't playing with his brother, who's only 18 months older than he is. Prior to him getting that vaccination, every milestone was on target. Everything was developing normally. These were the kind of stories that Dr. Andrew Wakefield was hearing from different parents. This graph is produced by the Autism and Development Disabilities Monitoring Network, CDC-funded group. So CDC, US Federal Health Agency in America, they fund a group, they produce this graph. This is not an anti-vaccine graph, this is a CDC-funded graph. Autism prevalence has increased 317% since 2000. But it's interesting because when I showed the graph in the previous talk of the vaccines, didn't you notice that from 1990 and so, you start seeing the explosion in number of vaccines, rotavirus, Gardasil, for example, all kinds of vaccines start coming up. You have the 4-in-1, the 6-in-1, more shots in a single, or more pathogen exposure in a single shot, and more shots in total, more repeat doses. 1970, the rate of autism, 1 in 10,000. 1995, 1 in 1,000. 99, 1 in 5,000. And then it starts jumping. You get to 2000, 2002, 1 in 150, gets to about 2014, and it's 1 in 68. You get to 2023, and it's 1 in 36. And it's like a linear straight line graph. Now, that is the CDC's own data. So if you're a federal health agency, and that's the health of your population, surely you should be trying to figure out what could be causing it. You can't just say, well, we don't know, right? You've got to do better than that. You're being paid full time to figure out how to make people healthier. So why would we persecute a researcher who has nothing to gain from it, from raising the question that in empirical science, that something you roll out could be the causative agent, even though that's according with what the parents are finding? Here's another example of the cost of contravening vaccinology. If you say the wrong thing, you recommend the wrong thing, if you get the wrong results, they may have problems for you to experience. So, Dr. Paul Thomas is a pediatrician. In the top right, you can see his book that he's produced called The Vaccine Friendly Plan. And basically, he's trying to say in his book and in his protocol that things to consider before you get vaccines. Timings, whether you should really do it, whether it makes sense for you and your family. And what happened was that he did a respective analysis on his own pediatric practice by comparing vaccinated with unvaccinated children. And why did he do this? Well, the CDC got wind of his vaccine-friendly plan and said to him, go and find out if it works as well as the CDC vaccination schedule. You're saying that parents should be far more cautious and follow your plan and maybe not take the vaccines or not at the right time. And we're saying take everything. Go and find out from your practice, or commission a study and work it out for us and come back to us. So he did that. He studied 3,300 children in his practice. It remains one of the largest vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies of a scientific population, of a specific population, ever published in a peer-reviewed journal. Just like Dr. Wakefield, it was retracted. You can see at the bottom right, there's the retraction notice from the journal. But not only was it retracted, you can see at the bottom there, a quote from Dr. Thomas, within a week or so, they yanked my license for clearly publishing the data that they had asked for. So if you do a bit of science and you get the result that the government don't like, they'll just take your medical license and retract your paper. I'll make sure that the journal folks retract your paper. So here's the Retracted study. There's actually a book on this by Jeremy Hammond, and it chronicles the persecution of Dr. Paul Thomas. It's called The War on Informed Consent, the persecution of Dr. Paul Thomas by the Oregon Medical Board. And I think persecution is an appropriate word to use for these doctors for what they're experiencing. So in the study, it found that vaccinated children who received 90 to 95% of the CDC recommended vaccines for their age group were about 25 times more likely than the unvaccinated group to see the pediatrician for an appointment related to fever. And we often brush this off because children are told by the pediatrician and the parents that, oh, it's just a reaction to a vaccine. And we just normalize, high-grade fever, 40 degrees, and all this stuff. Oh, it's just the immune system working. Well, no, if the child's screaming their head off and they've got really bad pain and, maybe that's things actually causing them harm. I mean, it's a simple concept, but, something that we should consider. And certainly they're having a lot more fever in the vaccinated group. 3 to 6 times more likely in the vaccinated group to visit the pediatrician for treatment related to anemia, asthma, allergies, and sinusitis. So again, not a good outcome. Visited the pediatrician for respiratory infections 70% more often than unvaccinated. Well, it's very hard to imagine why the CDC didn't like the study once it was produced. They asked for it, got the results, and didn't like it. I wonder why. And here's some more on the study's shocking results. So these graphs are a little small, so I'll describe them to you. Along the horizontal or the x-axis is cumulative number of is number of days basically. So number of days into the 10-year period. So the study starts on day 0, goes up to 3,650 days or thereabouts. Okay, and going up is the cumulative number of doctor office visits. So he's actually got a larger group who are vaccinated, because most children obviously are vaccinated, even in his own practice. So he has 2,763 vaccinated children. He has 561 unvaccinated. So what he does to make it like a fair test when he draws the graphs, he just multiplies the number of the unvaccinated by the multiplier factor 4.9, so that you're going to have a fair test when you try to compare the cumulative number of doctor visits. So what you're doing is every time a child goes to the pediatrician, you're going to count that as a doctor visit, okay? Whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated. You're then going to make sure that the numbers are fair when you compare them for the sample size. You're going to see which group visits the doctor more often. So as I mentioned, for many of these conditions, it's going to be the vaccinated. So the orange graph is the cumulative number of visits as you get into the 10-year period, and that's always the vaccinated cohort. And the blue side, or line rather, is the unvaccinated. So as you can see, as I mentioned, like asthma, breathing disorders, behavioral issues, respiratory infections, eczema, ear pain, anemia, dermatitis, it's all higher in the vaccinated group. So that was what he found. And you can see, it's interesting, the different shapes of the graph show you the different times when you start to have the onset of those issues. So for example, if you look at the ADHD graph, you can see that it starts off very similar, but there comes a time when the vaccinated in orange start to, that's this one here, start to really come away. And there's almost none of that in the unvaccinated group. It's all in the vaccinated group. Whereas other ones maybe have, like eczema, for example, which is this one here, you can see that the vaccinated almost immediately are overtaking the unvaccinated and stay at that rate for much longer. So you can actually see the progression of these conditions in the different children as well. So it's not hard to imagine why this study was not liked by the CDC and why it wasn't something that they wanted to see much more of. And also, in terms of the shameful history, moving just beyond vaccines, thinking of the pharmaceutical industry more generally, very important story. Hopefully, everyone knows this. If not, I'll give you a quick introduction. So there was a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug called Vioxx. It was produced by Merck. It was for relief for inflammation and pain, approved by the FDA, that's the US medical regulator, May 1999. However, again, if you trust the pharmaceuticals, they might not tell you the whole truth. Merck launched its largest study yet of their own drug, but they withheld critical data on the cardiovascular, that's the heart toxicity of Merck's drug Vioxx. And in late 1999, Merck's own Data and Safety Monitoring Board, that's their DSMB, identified the risk of serious heart problems, double that of a competitor drug, naproxen. So Merck had a couple of ways of knowing that their drug caused serious heart problems. They knew this wasn't unknown to them. Did they go and volunteer that information? Did they share all the data that they knew? Absolutely not. It came down to a whistleblower, one brave individual, Dr. David Graham. He wasn't able to take them on alone. He had to work with a whistleblowers group. who normally work with folks from national security whistleblowers, in other words, military whistleblowers. That's how difficult it was to take on the pharmaceuticals. So one man alone told the truth. He conducted a study on Vioxx. He was able to prove that it causes 88,000 to 139,000 heart attacks with a 30 to 40% fatality rate, resulting in a probable 30,000 to 55,000 deaths. And yes, the US medical regulator, FDA, tried to suppress Dr. Graham's findings. But that's interesting because we just saw that the CDC were not happy when Dr. Paul Thomas produced his evidence in his vaccinated versus unvaccinated study. It's almost like it's the same kind of scenario. Dr. Graham describes it as the worst public health disaster in history. His results are now published in The Lancet. So this is completely mainstream now. Like, everyone knows that Vioxx was a drug that caused heart problems, that killed people. The pharmaceutical Merck hid the data. FDA tried to destroy the whistleblower, and it eventually came out because the whistleblower got support from a whistleblower support group and was able to get the message out there. And this is the story of Vioxx. So this is the industry that we're talking about, the same industry that produces vaccines. And it is a dangerous industry. Okay, so in July 2020, there was a report. So just as the early times of the COVID pandemic times, the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review, that's the IMMDS review, looked at the UK medical regulator, MHRA, and they found systemic conflicts of interest within the MHRA. So to do with the individuals and the financial incentives, things like that. The yellow card scheme for reporting adverse reactions, the passive reporting system, not fit for purpose. We heard a lot of problems about that from the COVID vaccine times as well. So this report really looked at 3 drugs in particular. I can mention, which is Primados, a pregnancy drug, the Mesh, which is an implantable device for women, and sodium valproate, an anti-epileptic drug. So it was a pretty strong report. And it actually got cited more recently on the 24th of October 2023 in an all-party parliamentary group made up of politicians in Westminster from across the political divides on pandemic preparedness and response. So 21 MPs, there was a couple of lords, I think there was an earl in there as well. So 21 MPs, that's a lot of representation from Labour, Conservatives and other parties. And the letter raised serious patient safety concerns, claiming the MHRA operate in a way far from protecting patients and instead puts them at serious risks. And they wrote, "We also believe that the MHRA is at the heart of these far wider endemic failings and that those cited in this letter merely represent the tip of a sizable iceberg of failure." So I say that to make the point that there is a lot of consensus amongst even politicians that the UK's medical regulator is failing, is flawed, has conflicts of interest, and is not fit for purpose. The last section then I would like to consider. We hear a lot about the role of vaccines in decreasing mortality and increasing life expectancy, but I'd like to review that to see whether that's really so. So we're going to look at some graphs, and we're also going to look at some analysis, including from the CDC, to find out what the true drivers are that decrease mortality since about 1900 and increase life expectancy. So firstly, on the left side, you can see what I've just been describing. From about 1900, the dotted line shows that life expectancies kind of been edging along slowly upwards throughout the 20th century. Meanwhile, the age-adjusted death rate has been steadily decreasing since 1900 to the end of the 20th century. So we're all quite familiar with this story. And I'm going to be quoting from a paper from Geyer and colleagues in Pediatrics in 2001. And in this peer-reviewed study, Geyer and colleagues write, "Vaccination, while first used in the 18th century, 1796 with Jenner, became more widely implemented in the middle part of the century." So vaccines against diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis became available during the late 1920s. So you hear about them being developed in the 20s, but only widely used in routine pediatric practice after World War II. So when you examine the role of vaccines, you have to look into the late 40s and 50s before you're even going to start to see any evidence they could be working, because they weren't widely rolled out before the Second World War. Thus, vaccination does not account for the impressive declines in mortality seen in the first half of the century. So they can't be responsible if they're not being widely used. And a little bit more on declining US death rates in the same paper. The colleagues, Geyer and colleagues write, "State and local health departments implemented these public health measures, including water treatment, food safety, organized solid waste disposals, and public education about hygienic practices. These improvements in water and food safety and purity are linked to the major decline in diarrheal diseases. Now they want to have a rotavirus vaccine for diarrhea in the 90s, but your diarrhea mortality rates are already coming down due to all the aforementioned things. We can keep picking every single virus that can cause diarrhea and vaccinate against it, or you can just improve all these areas. So the major decline in diarrheal diseases seen in the early years of the century. Similarly, improvements in housing and decreased crowding in US cities are linked to the reductions in mortality from tuberculosis and other diseases attributable to person-to-person airborne transmission. If you go back to 1900 or before, the way people would live in terms of like open, sewage or horses with manure everywhere and things like that, treading into the houses and children playing in it and all kinds of things, and a poor understanding of waterborne diseases and potable water and things like that, especially in overcrowded, poor and slum areas. Of course, that's going to cause a lot of disease. It's absolutely natural. But that doesn't mean that the vaccines were the reason that you had fewer fatalities in those kinds of areas. And these are all the identified reasons that Geyer and colleagues point to for declining the US death rate. And let's take the example now of measles in particular. So in March 1963, the first 2 measles vaccines were approved for use in the US. So we have a live vaccine by Merck, and we had a formalin inactivated one produced by Pfizer. So as we said before, live and inactivated. So the graph on the right shows you the death rate for measles in America. Now you can see it starts off 12 per 100,000, and by 1960 it's almost at 0. But I haven't got a line in there showing when the measles vaccine was licensed and rolled out, because that graph only goes up to 1960, and the measles vaccine was licensed in 1963. So it doesn't appear. So whatever that improvement is, well, it can't be the measles vaccine, because the measles vaccine wasn't created within those data points. So the mortality's already come down. Dysentery, okay? So again, dysentery causing diarrhea, no vaccine produced, okay? So you see, again, same story from 1900 to 1960, and the deaths come down from, again, 12 in 100,000 down to almost 0 at 1960. Again, there's no line for when the vaccine was produced because there hasn't been a vaccine against dysentery. And you can see the World Health Organization, what's their view on diarrhea and mortality from diarrhea? Diarrhea remains a major killer, but it's largely preventable. Better water sanitation and hygiene, don't even mention vaccines, could prevent the deaths amongst children aged under 5 years, 395,000 in the year 2019. So if we can get water sanitation, we can get hygiene right, we're not going to see deaths from diarrhea. Well, that accords with, dysentery as well. We've seen the improvements in those areas for more of the population, fewer deaths. You don't need a vaccine for it. And influenza and pneumonia deaths, this time we do have a vaccine. So by 1945, the first influenza vaccine is approved for military use, followed in 1946 by an approval for civilian use as the World Health Organization. So I've drawn on this graph about the time when we have the influenza vaccine being rolled out. But again, you're seeing the death rate on the right side, and you're seeing the black line. It's already decreasing all the time, okay? And there's no real difference in the rate of decrease after the vaccine comes out, okay? So again, if it didn't solve dysentery and it didn't solve measles, did it really help you with influenza? Probably not. And what about the CDC's own view? Remember, CDC, US Federal Health Agency, on declining US mortality rate. Well, this actually is their graph. I don't know how much you can see of it, but I can describe it to you. And really what they're labeling on here is the declining US mortality rate. The first two data points they've actually identified is firstly, just after around the 1900, is 40 US states having health departments. And the CDC will point to the local health departments as helping to get out the health messaging around, water and around, hygiene, basically, wash your hands, things like that, and all this kind of thing as having an impact. The second one they point to is improved water. They're actually pointing to chlorine there. So first, continuous municipal use of chlorine in water in the United States. So that's into the 1900s at this point. And the death rate's already starting to come down. Obviously, you have a big peak with the Spanish flu after World War I. And then they start, as they go down, to talk about, 1940-ish, antibiotics, penicillin, the Salk vaccine, what we looked at that in the last session, that's polio. And then into the 60s, the passage of the Vaccination Assistance Act. But even the CDC will say at the bottom, the decrease in illness, and they're talking here about waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid, is credited to the implementation of drinking water disinfection and treatment, improving the quality of source water, and improvements in sanitation and hygiene. So again, the CDC don't leave it up to much doubt that the real reason that you're getting less deaths from waterborne diseases and things like these diarrheas and stuff is simply due to water disinfection and treatment. So that was what I want to share then on vaccines and mortality. And I'll just take a moment to summarize what we've looked at through this talk. So firstly, vaccinology around the globe today. We've seen that some parts of the world have mandatory vaccination policies. Mandatory as in there could be legal repercussions, perhaps even places like Brazil. There could be loss of parental rights or even loss of rights over the child for failure to comply with vaccine requirements. We've seen that there are 6 states in America, including California, where the personal belief exemption has now been removed. Closer to home, we've seen in the UK that whilst vaccination remains only a recommendation, there is a concern for children in a school setting when the teachers claim loco parentis and the vaccinator can claim that the child is gillic competence, which is very poorly defined with a lot of latitude, depends on the maturity of the child, that the child can consent to a vaccination without the parent's consent. And we've also seen some of the areas where vaccination is has still been made mandatory. For example, yellow fever, and also when it comes to mission groups like the Southern Baptist Convention mandating it for their missionaries on the mission field. Secondly, we did a review of the COVID tyranny and a case study in that. We saw the waste of money, we saw the lies, we saw the use of arbitrary measures like social distancing for 6 feet that was just made up on the spot. So we've seen a case study in our lives, in our lifetime, of what real tyranny can look like related to vaccines, vaccine passport. We've seen tyranny around demonization of unvaccinated people and those people who question the narrative. Thirdly, we took a pretty broad dive through folks over the last few decades who have dissented from the narrative, principally Dr. Andrew Wakefield at the Royal Free Hospital in London. We've seen that his reason for being involved was simply because he was listening to what was going on out there. He was doing pharmacovigilance, if you will. He was asking the questions that need to be asked in an empirical science. And for that, he should really be commended. We've seen Dr. Paul Thomas did his study that the CDC asked for on vaccinated versus unvaccinated children. He found that the unvaccinated had far fewer hospital or doctor office visits. But as soon as he did that, within a week, his medical license was revoked. And we've seen other examples, of course, with parents as well telling their own story of a vaccine injury. And yet we still don't have a fair conversation around the possible link between vaccines, certain vaccines, and autism. Finally, we reviewed vaccines and declining mortality. And we saw that even by the CDC's own admission and in other academic literature, it was water sanitation, it was better hygienic practices, it was less overcrowding, better sewage systems that contributed to the radical decline in diarrheal diseases and it causing mortality. And we even saw with some of the viral conditions like measles and influenza that it can't possibly be the vaccine that's driven lower mortality based on the mortality already declining before there was a vaccine. And we saw that through various graphs in the 20th century. So again, the same final thought I put up last time, just want to come back to it though. Remember with vaccines, it's just empirical science. Those dissenting voices that we heard from, they're just doing good science in my opinion. They're just looking at an empirical science, making observations, asking questions. Vaccines and vaccinology, it's not a miracle. It's just observations, testing, evaluation, inductive reasoning. There's nothing special in it. We all have the right to ask questions about an empirical science. That's what good scientists do. That's the only thing that makes sense. And again, I give and leave with the quote from the Word of God from Matthew chapter 8. This is an example of an actual miracle. This is an example of something that's actually worth celebrating. And Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, the leper, saying, "I will be thou clean." And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. That's the evidence of an actual miracle. That's what it looks like, not a vaccine, which is just a pretty grubby empirical science that everyone has the right to question and challenge at will. And just finally, thanks for listening. Once available, I'll put this talk with all the slides and all the references on my website, alltherisks.com. If you have any questions on vaccines, feel free to email me, jonathanweissman@protonmail.com. And thanks again for listening. Thanks, Luke.